In 1914, Japan had what we might call a career-defining moment, if careers were measured in conquered German territories. In just 2 months, a forgotten siege would transform Japan from a regional player into a superpower, setting the stage for Pearl Harbor and everything else that followed. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Arnie's Brain Train, where we discuss history like grown-ups. Fair warning, this video contains historical facts, military terminology, and some AI-generated images. Now, I know that some of you break out in hives at the mention of artificial intelligence, but relax, it's just some pictures. And while this topic isn't as controversial as some we usually cover, it might still make some people uncomfortable. That being said, I'll be using accurate historical terms, whether they bother you or not. If you're looking for sanitized history, might I suggest literally any other channel. Every video here has been researched, written, and put together entirely by me, sometimes taking weeks or months with years of research behind topics like this one. All of my sources are listed in the description below, and my hope is by the end of this video, you can understand how one forgotten battle launched Japan's transformation into the empire that would eventually attack Pearl Harbor. Here we go. Now, for starters, why should you even care about some dusty old battle from over a century ago? Well, here's the thing. This siege didn't just end Germany's dreams of Asian domination. It was the moment that Japan proved that they could take on European powers and win, launching them onto the path of superpower status that would eventually lead to Pearl Harbor, World War II in the Pacific, and the modern geopolitical landscape that we live in today. This is the exact moment that Japan went from being a regional player to a genuine world power, and Germany learned the hard way that their Asian empire was built on quicksand. The Siege of Tsingtao is like watching the birth of a superpower in real time. The opening move in a chess game that wouldn't end until atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Understanding this battle helps explain why Japan became so aggressive in the 1930s, why they thought that they could take on the United States, and how a single military victory can fundamentally transform a nation's place in the world. So, buckle up, let's go ahead and dive into the battle that made Japan a superpower. Let's start by understanding why this siege was so devastating. By 1914, Germany had carved out a nice little slice of China for themselves, the Shandong Peninsula, centered around the port city of Tsingtao, which they'd been developing since 1898. This wasn't just any colony, this was Germany's crown jewel in Asia, complete with the famous Tsingtao brewery that still makes beer today. Now, here's what's interesting. Germany's Asian empire was built on one massive assumption, that their European enemies would stay in Europe. They fortified Tsingtao against naval attacks from the sea, but they never seriously considered that someone might just walk overland from the north. That someone, as it turns out, would be Japan. Germany's presence in China wasn't exactly welcomed by the Chinese, but it wasn't unusual either. By 1914, European powers had carved up huge chunks of Chinese territory into colonies that they called spheres of influence. Germany's peace included valuable coal mines, modern infrastructure, and that strategically crucial deepwater port. They'd invested millions turning Tsingtao into a mini Germany in Asia. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Japan saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up. They had a military alliance with Britain, which meant that they were technically on the same side as France and Russia against Germany. But while Britain was getting pummeled in Belgium, Japan looked at Germany's isolated Asian territories and thought to themselves, well, someone's got to deal with this. According to historian Frederick Dickinson's War and National Reinvention, Japan's leaders saw this as their chance to establish themselves as the dominant Asian power once and for all. On August 15, 1914, Japan delivered an ultimatum to Germany that was pretty much just diplomatic trash talk. They demanded that Germany withdraw all warships from Chinese and Japanese waters and hand over the entire Shandong Peninsula to Japan. Not back to China, mind you, but to Japan. They gave Germany exactly 2 weeks to comply. The German response? Essentially, go pound sand. Governor Alfred Meyer Waldeck, commanding the German garrison at Tsingtao, had about 4,000 troops, a mix of German regulars, reservists, and local Chinese auxiliaries. He looked at his fortifications, looked at his small fleet of ships, and thought to himself, yeah, we'll fight. What he didn't realize was that he was about to face not just Japan, but Japan backed by Britain, with overwhelming naval and land superiority. This ultimatum was a coming-of-age thug-life moment for Japan. They weren't asking for negotiation or compromise. They were making demands like a regional superpower, which is exactly what they were becoming. This wasn't the Japan that had been forced to open its borders by American gunboats in the 1850s. This was a modernized, militarized nation ready to take on European colonial powers directly. Let's go ahead and talk about the numbers now, because they're kind of ridiculous. Japan assembled a force of over 60,000 troops for this operation. And remember, Germany only had 4,000. That means Japan had 15 times more soldiers than the Germans had. They brought their entire modern navy, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. And Britain, not wanting to be left out of the party, contributed their own naval squadron and about 1,500 troops. The German defenders, meanwhile, had some decent coastal artillery, a few aging warships, and fortress walls that looked impressive but were designed for a completely different kind of war. According to military historian Jonathan Clements in A Brief History of the Samurai, this wasn't just a mismatch, it was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except that the other guy brought a tank. Here's something fascinating to think about, for me anyway. The Germans knew that they were screwed, but they decided to fight anyway. Why? Well, we can only guess, but maybe national honor, military duty, and probably a healthy dose of, if we're going down, we're going down swinging. What's really remarkable is the logistics that were involved. Japan had to transport 60,000 troops, their equipment, supplies, and heavy artillery across the sea, and then coordinate a complex land and naval operation. This was more than about just having more soldiers. This was about demonstrating that Japan could project military power anywhere in the region with the same efficiency as European powers. On September 2, 1914, Japanese forces landed on the Shandong Peninsula and began what can only be described as a textbook siege operation. This wasn't just a chaotic medieval battle, this was modern industrial warfare at its most efficient. Unlike their contemporaries in Europe, the Japanese didn't just rush in guns blazing. Instead, they systematically cut off all supply lines, surrounded the German positions, and began a careful, methodical approach using the latest siege techniques. They dug trenches, built supply roads, and brought up heavy artillery piece by piece. Meanwhile, the combined Japanese-British naval force blockaded Tsingtao from the sea, ensuring that no supplies or reinforcements could reach the defenders. The Germans were completely isolated. No help was coming from Europe, and the local Chinese population had no interest in dying for German colonialism. What's really interesting is how modern this siege was compared to what was happening in Europe. While soldiers on the Western Front were charging into machine gun fire, the Japanese were using systematic artillery bombardments, coordinated infantry advances, and even aerial reconnaissance. This was some of the first military use of aircraft in Asia. The Japanese approach revealed something crucial. They weren't interested in glorious charges or heroic sacrifices. They wanted efficient, decisive victories that would establish their reputation as a serious military power. Now, if you're still thinking that this sounds like just another military history lesson, remember, understanding how Japan's rise to superpower status began helps explain everything from their invasion of Manchuria to Pearl Harbor. This siege was Japan's proof of concept that they could challenge European colonial powers and win decisively. By October 1914, Japanese heavy artillery was pounding German positions around the clock. Not like the small cannons you might imagine from old war movies, but rather these were massive modern siege guns that could punch through concrete and steel like tissue paper. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldier accounts preserved in the Bundesarchiv military archives describe the constant thunder of incoming shells, the impossibility of sleep, and the gradual realization that their situation was hopeless. Supply shortages meant that they were running low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. But the Germans weren't going down without a fight. They conducted several nighttime raids on Japanese positions, used their few remaining ships to shell Japanese landing areas, and their coastal batteries managed to damage several Japanese vessels. According to Charles Stevenson's Germany Asia-Pacific Empire, German resistance was fierce enough that Japanese casualties were actually higher than expected for what should have been a one-sided battle. The turning point came when Japanese aircraft, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary for 1914, began dropping bombs directly on German positions. This was some of the first strategic bombing in military history, and it showed the Germans that nowhere was safe. What made this bombardment so significant was its precision. The Japanese weren't just randomly shelling the area. They were systematically destroying specific military targets while largely avoiding civilian areas, because they wanted to capture Tsingtao's infrastructure intact. By November 1914, the writing was on the wall in letters that were basically 10 feet tall. German ammunition was running critically low, their outer defenses had been systematically destroyed, and Japanese forces were close enough to launch a final assault that everyone knew would be a massacre. On November 7, 1914, Governor Meyer Waldeck made the only rational decision left. He surrendered. The siege had lasted just over 2 months, but in that time, Japan had demonstrated to the world that they were no longer just a regional power player in Asia's backyard. They had successfully conducted a complex, modern military operation against a European power and won decisively. The surrender ceremony itself was almost anticlimactic. German officers handed over their swords, flags were lowered, and just like that, Germany's Asian empire effectively ceased to exist. Japan now controlled one of the most important ports in East Asia, along with all the infrastructure, businesses, and strategic advantages that came with it. Interestingly, the Japanese treated their German prisoners with considerable respect, following international conventions and even allowing German officers to keep their personal weapons as a sign of honor. This was Japan showing the world that they understood the civilized rules of warfare between major powers. Here's where the story gets really important for understanding modern history. Japan didn't just win a battle, they fundamentally shifted the balance of power in East Asia. Control of Shandong gave them a launching point for further expansion into China, access to valuable natural resources, and most importantly, the confidence that they could take on European powers and win. The international community's reaction was interesting to say the least. Britain and France were too busy fighting for their lives in Europe to care much about what Japan was doing in Asia. The United States was still trying to stay neutral. China, despite this all happening on Chinese territory, had virtually no say in the matter because they were dealing with internal political chaos. Historians acknowledge that this created what they call a power vacuum in East Asia, and Japan was more than happy to fill it. According to Rana Mitter's Forgotten Ally, the Siege of Tsingtao was the first domino in a chain of events that would eventually lead to Japanese occupation of Manchuria, full-scale war with China, and ultimately Pearl Harbor. The economic impact was equally significant. Japan now controlled the brewery, port facilities, railway connections, and coal mines. They had essentially inherited a fully functioning colonial infrastructure without having to spend decades building it themselves. Think about it this way. If you want to understand why Japan felt confident enough to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941, you just need to understand that their superpower confidence was built on decades of successful military operations, starting right here at Tsingtao in 1914. This siege taught them that the European powers could be beaten, and that lesson would prove incredibly dangerous 27 years later. Let's connect all these dots because this is where the story gets really fascinating. The Siege of Tsingtao wasn't just about one battle. It was about the moment Japan realized that they could challenge European colonialism and win, marking their transformation from regional power to emerging superpower. First, Japan proved that they could conduct modern, complex military operations on par with any European power. Second, they gained control of crucial territory and infrastructure that would support their future expansion. Third, and most importantly, they learned that the international community would essentially let them get away with territorial expansion as long as bigger conflicts were happening elsewhere. Germany's defeat at Tsingtao also revealed the fundamental weakness of European colonial empires. They looked impressive on maps, but they were actually extremely vulnerable to determine local challenges. This lesson wasn't lost on other Asian nations, and it planted seeds for the eventual collapse of European colonialism across the entire continent. And what about that beer company? Well, Tsingtao Brewery was taken over by Japanese management and continued operating. Today, it's one of China's most famous beer brands, and yes, you can still buy it in most grocery stores. Every bottle is a little reminder of this forgotten siege that changed world history. But perhaps most importantly, this siege established the template for Japanese expansion. Identify isolated European positions, use overwhelming force to capture them quickly, and present the international community with a fait accompli while they're distracted by other conflicts. And that's it, everybody. How one forgotten siege transformed Japan into a superpower and set the stage for everything that followed in the 20th century Pacific history. If this kind of deep dive historical analysis got your brain firing, hit that like button, subscribe to Arnie's Brain Train, and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our adventures through history's most fascinating forgotten stories. Remember, all of my sources are linked in the description below because I actually do the research and I always post my sources. Got a historical mystery that you want me to investigate? Go ahead and drop it in the comments below. Until next time, keep that brain train rolling, and I'll see you in the next adventure through history's most incredible stories. And remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. See you guys there. Bye.